You may or may not have noticed, there are 9 pages, so it is a lot to cover in 1 hour, and there is a lot of content. Um, there are some parts, though, that we are just going to focus on certain aspects, and the rest of the material is for you to look at and to examine on your own rather than that we're going to look at everything. Okay. First, I think it is important for us to understand that the scope of what we're looking at today. Okay, so we are covering a period, I've mentioned this to you before, called pre-literary history. So this is before history was ever recorded for us. Um, and then we have the birth of a nation, how Israel became a nation. We also have the united monarchy that is under Saul and David. And then we have the divided monarchy, and this is when it split into north and south. And then the exile, the north was conquered, and then the south was also conquered. But we focus on the south, so that's a Babylonian exile. And then the return from the exile and the building of the second temple, which is called by the Jews, they know it as the Second Temple period. And then next we look at Israel's Second Temple period, and then after that, Judea under Roman control. Okay, so the temple was destroyed in AD 70, and then Judea came under direct Roman control. Okay, so today we want to look at the story of the Old Testament, the whole sweep of it. And so first we look at the pre-literary history. And Genesis 1 and 2 easily represents some of the most difficult texts in the Bible. Okay. Here we have the accounts of creation in Genesis 1 and 2, and this is often presented as something irreconcilable to the theory of evolution. Now, if this is true, if we think of the creation as an account of how the world was literally created, then we may have a problem. But we need to return to the question that we started with earlier on that says, what is meaning? How do you understand the Bible? So we need to go back to the point that it is authorial intention. What is the author's intention when something is given to us? So we need to ask ourselves a question. Is the creation story intended to be an account of how the world was created? Now, if that is the case, that means if God wants to give us a playbook on how the world was created, then you'll find that it is quite incompatible with evolution. But if that is not what God wanted to represent for us in Genesis 1 and 2, then perhaps it is not irreconcilable. So, for example, if Genesis is intended to tell us how God made the world function, then there's no inherent conflict with evolution. So let me give you an example. If you take a bus guide, the bus guide is to tell you how the buses function. The bus guide tells you the different bus routes and how to get from A to B, the different points. It is not an intention of, it doesn't tell you how the company was created. It doesn't tell you how buses are made. So if you look at a bus guide and say, how are buses made? You're asking the wrong question of the bus guide. Okay, so if it is a functional document of how the world functions, then perhaps we can be reading it the wrong way. So it is important to understand what is the authorial intention of Genesis 1 and 2. I think the jury is still out, and I have no expertise in the field of evolution, so I'm not ready to make strong assertions. However, what I do know a little bit more is the scriptures, the text itself. Now, if I were to ask you today, what did God create on which day of the creation days, of the 6 days of creation, you would probably be hard pressed to give me an answer. But after this, once you understand the framework, you will forever know how to answer this question. Okay? So this is the schematic of the creation story. Is day 1, 2, 3 on one side and day 4, 5, 6 on the other side. So on day 1, you'll find that God created light and darkness. On day 4, he created the sun and the moon. On day 2, he created the sea and the dry land, okay, and also the sky. And on day 5, you find that he created birds and fish. Okay. And then on day 6 was a plant life, and on day 3 plant life, day 6 animals. So if you look at it, you'll find that day 4, 5, 6 describes more fully what you have in day 1, 2, 3. Okay, so when it says light and darkness, it doesn't tell you where the light comes from or anything like that. But day 4 tells you sun and moon. Okay, day 2 talks about the sea and the dry land and the expanse in between. Okay, and then to fill up the sea, it talks about the fish. To fill up the sky, it talks about the birds. Okay, and then day 3, you have plant life on the dry land. And day 6, you have the animals eating the plants. Okay. And the human mind works such that if I ask you to remember the 6 days and memorize it by heart, it is actually quite difficult. But if you understand the schematic, you will find it much easier to remember. Because if somebody were to ask you, what did God do on day 4? Then you go across in your mind to day 1 and 2. He created light and darkness. So you can say, oh, he created the sun and moon, right? Then if you know day 2 and you don't know day 5, sea and dry land and the expanse in between, then you say, oh, okay, then it's fish and birds. And then day 3 is plant life, and then day 6 is animals. So some people have said it cannot be literal days because you look at day 3. Day 3 is plant life. So how can there be plant life before sun and moon, before photosynthesis and all that? Yeah, so you need to understand that Genesis is a literary work. It is not meant to be early scientific work at all. Okay, so you need to understand literature as literature. You cannot understand literature as science and then say that it does not jive with the science that we know today. And by the way, the science that we know today is also not ultimate science, because earlier on they say that there's no way that the whole of humanity can come from one man and one woman. Well, more lately, evolution says that there is an evolutionary Eve, that there was one woman who immigrated from Africa, from which the rest of the world came. Ex-Africa. Okay. Well, now they are saying that it is possible. And then there is now another study that says that all human beings can be traced to one man. Of course, the evolutionary Adam and evolutionary Eve doesn't fit the biblical narrative of Adam and Eve. And we're not saying that they are the same. But what we're talking about is whether or not it's even possible. And so they used to say it's not even possible. Today they'll tell you it is possible. And that is what they're arguing about now. So what you see here is this. What you see here is that you have a case where science would refute the Bible and then would contradict itself. So you need to ask yourself how reliable science is. All right. Now, we know that the 7th day is the day of God's rest. And so theologians rightly observe that God's rest lasted from creation until now, meaning that God's rest was not a 24-hour day. The 7th day was not a 24-hour day. Now, so for people who argue that the 6 days of creation are 24-hour days or 7 24-hour days, you do have a problem. You have a problem with the 7th day, because the 7th day is obviously not a 24-hour day period. Then there are some people who try to match that with evolutionary time frames and say that there are 6 different periods or 7 or 8 or how many periods there are. I think that is an exercise in futility, because again, the Bible is not written to match some future evolutionary theory, and nor is there any attempt to reconcile the two. But to understand the authorial intent of Genesis 1 and 2 is critical for us to understand the text. So now, possible meanings of the creation story. One is that it is a story about God's orderliness, that is God's goodness. So man was created when the world was ready for him, basically on the 6th day. God didn't create man on the 1st day and then he sort of stuck in limbo in the middle of nowhere, or the 2nd day or the 3rd day. But after the entire creation was created, it talks about God's provision for humanity through his creation. So if the objective of Genesis 1 and 2 is a devotional objective, telling the people, look, God is a good God. He prepares everything for you, for your sustenance, for your existence, for your enjoyment, then the story takes on a different meaning. Now, as God's crowning work of creation, we can also understand it as human beings as God's crowning work of creation, that we are given a mandate of stewardship towards creation. So that might be the meaning. Another possible meaning is that it is a story to instill the importance of the Sabbath rest as in the order of creation. So this is actually quite a strong argument that when it is framed as a 7-day creation, the purpose is to tell the people that as God rested on the Sabbath day, on the seventh day, so you are to rest on the seventh day. And that might be the motivation behind this story. Or another option is that it reminds us of who we are, that we are God's image bearers. And that is the main point. Or that it teaches the virtue of work. Because before the fall of man, humanity was given a task to do, and it was good, honorable, and pleasing to God for man to do work. In contrast to ancient cosmologies that typically depict work as something that is bad, that the gods don't want to do. And then they punish the people by making the people do work for the gods. Okay? So there are various ways of looking at it, and I am not an OT expert. I've not come down on one particular thought yet, and I'm sure there are more than these. But this is to give you an idea that when you come to Genesis 1 and 2, you need to come back to the basic premise of what is meaning. And meaning has to do with intent, a thorough intention. What did God intend this text to be? Now, until today, biblical scholars have not come to a conclusion on that. We have several options, but we have not come to a conclusion on that. Okay. Now, the next thing that we look at is Genesis 3, and it is primarily about the fall of humanity, well, Genesis 2 and 3. So the narrative of the fall of humanity in Adam and Eve should be understood as literal. So that is how I take it. That unlike the creation account, which has several literary considerations, I believe the narrative of the fall of Adam and Eve should be more literal. Why? Well, this is because the New Testament speaks of Adam as one man and not as humanity. You see, the word Adam in Hebrew means a man. Okay, so it says when God created Adam, God created man. So some people say maybe God created mankind through evolution, not a single human person called Adam. Well, that is one argument from language. However, what we see in the New Testament is this. Romans 5:12 tells us, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, so death spread to all mankind because all sin. So in the New Testament, the theology of the sinfulness of man goes back to Adam being one person rather than humanity. Of course, you can sort of make it work, say that, oh, humanity fell as a whole and all that, and because of this, all of us are fallen. But that is really complicated. The rule is Occam's razor. Occam's razor is that the simplest explanation is always the best. Okay, so despite whatever difficulties, the simplest explanation is always the best. It's just like whether the earth revolves around the sun or the sun revolves around the earth. If you make the sun revolve around the earth, you have to compensate for all kinds of things when you are calculating the movements of the stars. And it becomes impossibly complex. And whereas the sun revolving around the earth, centuries ago when they were debating this question, it makes everything simple. And so the simplest explanation is always the best, almost always the best, okay? Now, the theology of how the sin of Adam affects us is also tied to the fall as a literal event, okay? So the tradition view of the sinfulness of mankind is that sin is carried down through the natural process of procreation. So the federal view, so there are different views of how people become sinners. Okay, the federal view is that the sin of Adam affects us because he's the representative head of all humanity. So, for example, a head of state declares war. The rest of the people didn't declare war, but everybody is affected because he's the federal head. So that's the federal headship view. So we take the Traducian view of the fall of man, that Adam was one man, not figurative, for all humanity, and as much as the DNA of Adam was passed down through his descendants, so was that sinfulness. Okay. All right. Now, so we need to go on because there are lots to cover. The next thing has to do with the flood. There are two main views, the global flood and the catastrophic local flood view. We will not enter into that protracted debate, but it is good to know what most evangelical theologians think. Most lean towards a global flood that is based on the text. Fundamentally, if we take the view of an old earth, we will argue for a local flood. And if we take the view of a young earth, we will argue for a global flood. So I'm more inclined to the young earth theory rather than the old earth theory. That is to say, the geologic features that we see around us today. Some geologists say that these take millions of years to form, but these geologic features can actually be formed very quickly if the cause is water rather than wind. Because they say, oh, the wind erosion takes so many thousands or millions of years to effect this. But by the same token, if the erosion were water erosion instead of wind erosion, then it will be like several thousand times faster. Okay. So up to this point, my view is this. Number one, fiat creation, meaning that God created by the power of his word. Okay. He created everything from nothing. He created ex nihilo. And next is a literal Adam and Eve. Third, is more likely young Earth with global flood, but I need to clarify that it is not the 6000 BC date. Okay, some people say young Earth means you believe 6000 BC. I don't. Okay, and the fourth point is that it is not 24-hour days, because the seventh day is definitely not talking about 24-hour days. And then number five, we need to discover the authorial intention. One of the author's intention is seen in the literary framework of the creation account. Okay, other things are not as, I think, well established. There are different positions, but what is clear is that the literary framework is found in the creation account, and so that is one anchoring point. So when there are various views and various thinking and various concepts, we need to zero down on the things that we can zero down on. Down to. Okay, so if you can zero down on some of these fixed things, then other things build on top of the things that you're able to fix. All right, the next thing is the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel is found in Genesis 11, and the Tower of Babel is a story that is both historical as well as theological, meaning that it happened. Okay. Linguistically, it is clear that our current languages can be traced to major groups, even though it is hard to prove that there was only one language at a past point in time. But we do know that there are many language groups, and that they can be sort of traced backwards. Okay. And the next point is that the Tower of Babel event is located in the land of Shinar. So the land of Shinar is also the location of Babylon along the Fertile Crescent. By now you know what the Fertile Crescent is. So Babylon is also the land of Shinar in the Bible. In Daniel chapter 1 verse 2, we are told, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, referring to Babylon, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Babylon later would become the symbol of the city that opposed Jerusalem and the city that exiled Jerusalem. So Babylon was judged and was destroyed, but it remained a symbol of opposition against God. Now, in the New Testament, Babylon was a metonymy for Rome. So, like in First Peter, when he wrote that he was writing from Babylon, he was probably writing from Rome and not literal Babylon. Okay, and so First Peter 5:13, she who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings, and so does son Mark, my son. Okay, in Revelation 18. Then a mighty angel picked up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, "So shall Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence, and I will be and will be found no more." So Babylon is the archetype of the enemy city of God. Okay. All right. Now we look at the time of the patriarchs. So the patriarchs were from Genesis 12 onwards. I've given you some of the dates there. These are all tentative dates because there are different ways of trying to configure this. Okay. Now, by the time of the patriarchs, writing started to take shape. And the first writings were just merchant transactions and all that. Now, the physical world of the patriarchs was just around the major civilizations around the Fertile Crescent. So the patriarchs were basically Arameans, and the Israelites were to recount this. Like in Deuteronomy 26:5, it says, "And you shall make response before the Lord your God. A wandering Aramean was my father. And he went down into Egypt and sojourned there, few in number, and there he became a nation great, mighty, and populous." So you are talking about the Aramean nation. Now, this refers to a Semitic linguistic group which occupies Aram or modern day Syria. So they spoke Aramaic. It is both an ethnic term as well as a language identifier. And it is likely that the patriarchs spoke Aramaic, and Hebrew as a language had not even arisen at that time. Okay? Now, many of their cultural practices were recorded for us, but they are not meant to be prescriptive, they are only descriptive. So, for example, when Abraham and Sarah could not have a child, Sarah said, "Well, go into my handmaid Hagar to have a child through her," and all that. It doesn't mean that, therefore, if a man is not able to have a child, then he should, take on another woman. These are descriptions of what happened, and it is not prescriptions. Next, we need to know that the patriarch's understanding of God was limited. And we must allow for progressive revelation, meaning over time we get to know God's heart better. You also notice that the patriarchs were the spiritual heads. That means who performed the sacrifice? Well, it was Abraham. It was Isaac who did the sacrifice. It was Jacob who did the sacrifices. Later on, we had the priesthood. But before that, it was the patriarch, the head of the family, who was doing the sacrifices. Now, we also need to understand the Habiru and the Hebrew. Historically, the patriarchs became Habiru, which is probably where we get the term Hebrew. Now, the Habiru were a group of displaced people who lived on the fringes of established society of that time. They were often identified as mercenaries, wanderers, herdsmen, etc. Somewhat akin to the nomad, like the Bedouins in the Middle East. Or in China, you have the Hakka people. Now, the Hakka is called the guest people, right? Because they had actually immigrated from elsewhere. They were not fully nomadic, but they were not part of the established civilization either. So we do not know why they became the Hakka people. We know a little bit as to why Abraham became a Habiru, but we do not know why the other people became Habiru. So Habiru was not a term that was restricted to Abraham. It was referring to a group of people who were on the fringes of established society, who were more or less migratory in character. So the reference to the Hebrews began with the patriarchs, and it continued through their sojourn of 400 years in Egypt, and so they were called the Hebrews. You'll notice that in the Exodus account, they were always called Hebrews. the term Jew was never used, right? They were always called Hebrews. And even during the time of Judges and through the lifetime of David, the Philistines called David a Hebrew. Okay, so the word Habiru or Hebrew was the earlier term for the Jewish people. And the term Hebrew fell into disuse during the monarchy because the sons of Israel were no longer Habiru. They were no longer on the fringe of established society. They had become established society. So they were called Israelites. Okay, so that is the understanding behind the word Hebrew. Next, we come to the birth of a nation. In Exodus 1 to Joshua 24, we have the sons of Israel settled in Egypt, sons of Israel or sons of Jacob. Okay? From there, it became a distinct nation. Okay, so this is probably when the Hebrew language arose, meaning that they started, the patriarchs probably spoke in Aramaic. Then how did the Hebrew language arise? And the Hebrew language probably arose while they were in Egypt for 400 years. Okay, so this was a long period of isolation. And the isolation within Egypt happened because they were in Goshen, they were separated from the Egyptians, and then they were separated also because of persecution. Some people have asked, who was Joseph in Egyptian history? Now, it is just for your interest. Some people say that he was Imhotep. So you can look that up if you want to. Who was the Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, who started persecuting the Hebrew people? Well, some people say that they were the Hyksos. And so you can also look that up to see who were the Hyksos people. Okay. And who was the princess who adopted Moses? Some people say that was Queen Hatshepsut. And again, you can look that up. We will not go into it. Also, the event of the crossing of the Red Sea. Some people have argued that the event of the crossing of the Red Sea was not literal, but we believe that it was literal. And so people have gone about looking for artifacts in the Red Sea and in the wilderness wandering and have found some evidence of it. So again, I leave that to you to examine. The next thing is Israel in the wilderness to the death of Moses, when they were wandering in the wilderness. So the original trip was supposed to last only 2 years. But because they refused to enter the promised land, God says you will wander for 40 years. So it was actually 2 plus 38 years. Okay. And this is the mercy of God. The mercy of God counts inclusive years. And this is the custom from which, for example, in the sentencing of a court, okay, somebody is arrested and he posts bail and he's out actually walking around. And if the court case takes 2 years and he was sentenced to 10 years, the question is, do the original 2 years count or not? And when they add that in, that means the sentence is actually for 8 more years after the first 2 years, right? And the first 2 years, actually, he was running around quite freely. So this is the idea that actually that has been incorporated into our judicial system, where there is a level of mercy even shown to people who have done wrong. Number 3, Joshua conquers the promised land. So Joshua was the second Moses. If you read in the accounts, you actually see traces of it. For example, Moses parted the Red Sea, Joshua dried up the Jordan River so that they could go across and all that. Okay, so also notice the journey from the Transjordan area, up Edom, up Moab and Ammon, and then they positioned themselves across Jericho and they moved into the Transjordan area. Okay, so the conquest moved from Cisjordan to Transjordan to Cisjordan, which is the main story. Okay. Now, the ethical issue of supposed genocide. So this one is one of those subjects that come up in the book of Joshua, and we can look at this a separate time. I've looked at it. I've taught it before in the past about how we have to understand this genocide. It was more a case of driving out the people from the land. They could convert and all that. So there was either an elimination or an assimilation of the Canaanites. And because of the Joshua event, the earliest traceable people on the land of Israel are basically the Jews, because there are no Canaanites today. Okay. So the use of terminology and the assimilation of peoples, like in the case of the Habiru or Ishmael as the father of the Arab people. Elsewhere, I've taught the story that the Arab people say that they are descendants of Ishmael, right? And then they go back to the biblical story of Ishmael. But when you look at the biblical story of Ishmael, Ishmael and Hagar went off to live in Arabia. But it doesn't mean that there was nobody living in Arabia at that time. There were already people living in Arabia. So the people who were already living in Arabia became identified with Ishmael because probably he was a great leader. And therefore, he was identified with, they identified themselves with Ishmael. So the same thing with the question of the Israelites. Not all Israelites came from Egypt. Okay, some of them were the Habiru, they came from Egypt, they settled onto the land. Some of it was intermarrying with the Canaanites, rightly or wrongly it happened, and our conversion of the Canaanites. So they all became the Hebrew people. So you may say in terms of DNA, the Jews were never a pure race. In fact, when they were in the migratory route out of the wilderness, we are reminded that it was a mixed multitude that came out of Egypt. And then this mixed multitude became one nation in that 40 years. So we needed a whole generation to die off before they could identify themselves as one people. It is just like in Singapore. Many of our grandparents' generation, they do not identify themselves as Singaporeans, simply as people from China or people from India, and all that. And it took a whole generation for Singaporeans to identify ourselves as Singaporeans. Okay, so this is basically the same kind of dynamic that was at work in the biblical times. And then the settling into the promised land. So this was the time of the judges. Now, for those of you who are interested to know a bit of background, you can look into the collapse of the Bronze Age starting in 1177 BC. This was a very strange event in the history of humanity where all of a sudden, all the major civilizations collapsed. So it is almost like in our world today, you have, China, a great power, the United States, a great power, Russia is a great power, Europe is a great power. And overnight, all these civilizations disappear and everything breaks up. So imagine the United States breaks up into various, provinces and tribes. The China, same thing, all the different dialect groups become different nations again. And so this was what happened from 1177 BC. Until today, historians don't know why it happened or how it happened. But some believe that there was some natural disaster that caused this. But this is also linked to the invasion of a group of people called the Sea Peoples. They were possibly from Crete, possibly from, it's called the Minoan civilization. Okay, and these people were most likely the Philistines that you read about. So if you were to look into the Bible, before the time of the judges, you don't see the Philistines. Okay, then suddenly the Philistines were in the promised land, and then they were fighting for a piece of land. And so these people were most likely the Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples are recorded also in the Egyptian records about they being migratory people. During this period also of the judges, so you can look more into that if you want to. During the period of the judges, there was also the action of the tribe of Dan, where they went north to the town of Laish and conquered it, and then that became the expression Dan to Beersheba. So note this is this is a common anachronism in OT studies. I've already explained what anachronisms mean, right? Something that is out of time. Okay. Okay. Next, the United Monarchy. Okay, so first we have a transition of judges to kings. So note the pivotal role of Samuel as that pivot, the last judge of the Israel, transitioning and ordaining and anointing the first king of Israel, Saul. King Saul is an example of a response to God's demand for a king. Okay, so the people wanted a king now. And because they couldn't wait for God, God says, okay, the best thing that I can do for you, since you want a king now, is this guy called Saul. And so I think this is actually a devotional lesson for us. We really need to wait upon God's timing rather than insist on our timing for things. Okay? King David. So King David is the story of David is a brutally honest depiction of a broken hero. All right, so he is a hero in the story, but he is clearly a broken hero. And this is really atypical of ancient writings. People try to hide things that are not so nice. Okay, and until today, you see it is true. So, for example, our Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, is a hero figure in Singapore. But then, in many depictions of this hero, some of the more unpleasant things are hidden away from people. Okay? In the same way that when we studied Sir Stamford Raffles, in history, he's this wonderful, clever guy, British guy who located Singapore and all that. But there are actually a lot of also issues in the life of Raffles that people do not talk about. Okay, so this depiction of a broken hero is actually way ahead of his time. Nobody depicted broken heroes. Okay, so David was a very powerful picture of a broken hero. Then the rest of the kings, you talk about the rivalry between the house of Saul and the house of David. So that's one thing that you need to look at, how eventually the house of Saul basically disappeared. Okay, and then also when you look at the end of David's reign, so at the end of David's reign, he so to speak died with a whimper and not a bang. He grew old, he became decrepit, he failed to declare the next king. There was a coup with Adonijah and all that kind of stuff. Okay, and he was old and he was a little bit senile and incapable of any more military exploits. He didn't go out in a blaze of glory. Okay, he died an old man. Okay, Solomon. We saw Solomon's good years, his decline, and eventual redemption. So, due to the shortage of time, I'll not talk about the meaning of Solomon's wisdom, and we'll go on. Okay. Then you have the story of the divided monarchy. That is when the kingdom split into two. After Solomon, there was Rehoboam, and then it split into two. There was a northern kingdom, was ruled by Jeroboam the first, followed by many kings from several dynasties, and there was not a single good king of the northern kingdom. So Israel survived as a nation, however, until around 722, when it was conquered by Assyria. It was then followed by the Assyrian genocide of Israelites through deportation and mixed marriages, creating a group of people called the Samaritans. So this is where the Samaritans of the New Testament come from. Okay, they were the admixture of Assyrians and the northern Israelites who also lost their faith and had a syncretistic faith on account of this mixed marriages with the northern kingdom, with the people of Assyria creating the northern kingdom. The southern kingdom, or Judah, was ruled by Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. And these different kings, there were mixed virtues. There were good kings and there were bad kings. And this is how the southern kingdom operated. Now, so we look at the religious life. The religious life of the people was largely influenced by the civic religion of the king. So this is the idea of civic religion is something that we need to understand. In our world today, where we talk a lot about the separation of religion and politics, we don't have a strong sense of the role of civic religion. So to understand civic religion, many of us here are Chinese, and I'm sure this is also true in India. This is just under this category called religious phenomenology. Okay, so the emperor of China would sacrifice to the Most High God. Okay, in the Temple of Peace, the Temple of Heaven today. Okay, and so it is like they act as the representative of the people to God. They were the priests. They were acting as priests for the people to God. And then you find that folk religion imitates the same thing. So in a small town in China, for example, in those ancient days, right, you will have the most prominent people of the town leading the religious processions, offering the sacrifices and doing all the religious rites. Okay, so this is what we call civic religion. Now, so in the ancient world, civic religion was very important. The Egyptians did it, the Chinese did it, the Jews did it. And so this was how the religious life of the people were organized. Even the Romans did it, by the way. Okay, so it was the same thing. It was centered around the temple and the sacrifices. Now, the incongruity of the temple in Jerusalem, located in Judah, strongly motivated the Israelite kings to build a rival and apostate temple, okay, in Samaria. And that is why there was that problem. So the temple was supposed to be built only in Jerusalem in order to manage and control the teaching and the instruction. But they built a rival one in Samaria because they don't want all the northern Israelites to go and worship in Judah, in Jerusalem. So if the people's religion is in Jerusalem, then they would lose their people to Jerusalem. So they created their own temple because of the need for this civic religion. Now, the priests were paid by the king, and they were under the control of the court. And therefore, during the divided monarchy period, you see that the king was the determining factor in the welfare of the people. And so the prophets were different from the king. The prophets were not paid by the king. The prophets were people who were, so to speak, supported by the free will donation and goodwill of the people. And so the prophets were the people who ended up speaking for God. And the priests ended up being the advocate for the established civic religion. And so many times you'll find a contradiction between the priests and the prophets. And on occasion, though, some priests became prophets. And so you need to understand the role of the priests and the prophets. And in the prophetic writings of the Old Testament, you'll find that they always sounded to be very angry because they were speaking as God's representative, confronting the apostasy and the immorality of the land, starting with the one who is the most powerful, the king, and all the nobles, and they shaped society to their own advantage. So these often stood as spiritual prosecutors against the king. Okay, this is why they always sound angry. Okay. Now, below here, I have a chart for you of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, and where you can find them in the text. Under the kings of Judah, I want your eyes to run down to the third king called Asa. And in front of Asa, I put G, right? G meaning he was a good king, okay? And before Jehoshaphat, you also see G, okay? And he was also a good king. And then you go down to Joash. He was partially good, so he's half, okay? Amaziah was partially good. Azariah was partially good, also called Uzziah. And then Hezekiah was a good king. Your eyes run down. And Josiah was also a good king. Okay, so all the good kings are here. All right. Okay. Then when you compare the kings and the prophets, this is a different chart again, where they are the kings of Israel, the kings of Judah. So here are the kings of Israel, and these are the kings of Judah. Okay. And then you have the prophets of Judah for Judah and the prophets for Israel. Okay, so these are the different groups of people ministering to different kings during different periods. Okay, again, we will not look at this in detail. This is something that you can look on your own. Now, one of the most important things in the development of the Old Testament was the Babylonian exile. In the prophecies of Jeremiah, he was saying something that was ironic. He's saying that there are two baskets, the baskets of good figs and bad figs. And the good figs are the one who went into Babylonian exile, and the bad figs were the ones who remained in the land of Israel. So during the Babylonian exile, King Nebuchadnezzar got the best of the land and carried them off to Babylon. And so all the best scholars, technicians, priests, the literati were carried off into Babylon. Okay, and then they developed as a distinct people. So in the same way that Israel developed its identity as Israel, as different from the rest of the Habiru in Egypt, then the Jews developed into a special group of people during the Babylonian exile. And this is when they became Jews, because they were people of Judah, and this is why they were called Jews. Okay, and so that was the Babylonian exile for 70 years, and then you have the different prophets during this period. Okay, I will not go through all the details there, and you can read it yourself. So after a period of time, there was a return from the exile. The first group came back under Zerubbabel in 538 BC. Now, you would find that it was actually less than the full 70 years, because there were several exiles to Babylon. The first one was in 605. And so you can count from the first date of the Babylonian exile or the last date, or you can count from the first return or the last return of the exile. But when you put it together, basically what you find again is God's graciousness. So the 70 years of exile was counted from the very first exile. Okay, and then the people started to come back. Then there were the post-exilic prophets, meaning prophets that came back after the exile, and they were Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Okay, so the return from the exile, however, filled the people with a deep sense of dissatisfaction with the spiritual state of the nation. So during the exile, they were told that you will come back. God will build a new temple, and this temple will be a wonderful, glorious, great temple. But when they came back and they built the temple, they wept, because this temple was not even like that of Solomon's temple. Where is this great temple that the exilic prophets were talking about? And so there was like a lack of a fulfillment of the great temple that they were looking forward to. And this actually brings us to Jesus Christ, who is the temple, who is the great temple that the exilic prophets were talking about. Okay, but before we jump ahead to that, we want to understand that the Second Temple period is considered from 516 BC to AD 70, where it was destroyed by the Romans. So during this time, the Judea was under Persian control for a time, and then after that, when the Persians fell to the Greeks, then it was under Greek control. And that was a time when the Jews suffered very badly, because the Greeks had the idea that they want to push Greek influence and Greek culture on everybody else. And they wanted to destroy the Jewish faith and to promote Hellenism, okay, and meaning Greek culture. And so this culminated with the Seleucid king called Antiochus IV, who was also called Epiphanes, meaning the enlightened one. So he's also called Antiochus Epiphanes. So he seized control of the temple and he sacrificed a pig on it. Okay? And he prohibited circumcision to obliterate the Jewish identity. So when you read about the abomination of desolation, and you talk about the abomination and the defiling of the temple, they were talking about this period that is associated with Antiochus Epiphanes. Okay, so there was actually this historical event. So those of us who are very conscious of the second coming issues, I want you to go back historically to this event to understand that there was a historical reference to this event. Okay, so how much of it is historical, how much of it is future? Again, that's another story that we can talk about another time. Okay. Now, because of this push for Hellenism, the Jewish opposition arose, and Judas Maccabeus led a group of people, and he created and overthrew the Syrians. the Seleucid is basically ruled from Syria, but they were Greeks. Remember the Alexander's empire was split into four, and so all the rulers and the aristocrats were Greeks, even though they were ruling Syria at that time. After the decline of the Greek dynasty or the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire arose. Okay, and so Israel came under Roman control from 63 BC. Okay, and so Judea under Roman control. So that is the background, the foreground for us for the New Testament. So the New Testament background is the Jewish story in the Old Testament. But the New Testament foreground is actually the Roman Empire, and both are important. So for us today in Singapore, we would say, oh, there are some of us who have this background of coming from China, coming from India, or being the Malay background. But then there's a foreground. And actually, the foreground probably exerts at least as much influence as the background, our day-to-day issues. Okay, so that is Judea under Roman control in the New Testament period. So then we see that the Old Testament story is a story about God's intention for humanity and human failure. God created the world good, man sinned, and then he had to raise a godly line, the sons of God, meaning the descendants of Seth, and then humanity kept declining. So the great flood came, and again he plucked humanity out through Noah. Humanity kept falling. Then he chose Abraham to be his representative, but not all the sons of Abraham were good, or nor the sons of Jacob. Then he picked the tribe of Judah, and from the tribe of Judah he picked the house of David, and then from David you find the Messiah arose. Okay, and this is the storyline for us that takes us from the Old Testament into the New Testament. Now, the story did pause during the intertestamental period. So, meaning at the end of Malachi to before Jesus came. So the Jews said that God has stopped speaking to us. So there are times in history when God stops direct revelation. Okay, so it is nothing new at all. And so the Jews at that time were a broken people. They were politically weak. They were a third-rate nation. And it is clear that they would never amount to anything other than being a third-rate nation unless God intervenes and sends the promised Messiah. And this is why they always talk about the Messiah and that the Messiah will bring God's glory back to Israel. However, their concept of the Messiah was a bit mistaken, and so Jesus came as the fulfillment of the temple. So Jesus is the temple, and Jesus is the Messiah, and Jesus is the King. Jesus is the prophet. Jesus is the priest for the people. So Jesus is the culmination of the Old Testament story. Okay, so this is all I have for today. For you, I wanted to end a bit earlier so that you can, if you can squeeze in a couple of questions, it'll be good. Okay, you can unmute yourself if you have a question and go ahead and ask. No question or too many questions. Okay. Well, I hope that today you would have a good grasp of the whole Old Testament story. Okay. That God has a plan in history. It is being executed. It's being carried out. We don't understand all of the Old Testament, but we do understand a lot of it. Okay. So to say that we don't understand the Old Testament at all would be an overstatement, or to say that we understand all of it would be an overstatement. There are lots of questions, but the main storyline is actually quite clear. Okay, so if we are all done, then we will end today's lesson. Okay, thank you all for your attention, and we would now get
Pastor,
ready.
sorry. I
Yes.
think there's a question at the chat.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
Chat,
by
huh?
Helen.
Okay. Okay, where is the gene for sin in the human genome today? I don't know. Okay. So basically, we are talking about in the same way that we inherit our DNA from our parents, we also inherit the sin. Okay, so I'm using the term sin as a genes as a general term, or however you want to perceive it. I'm using it in terms of how we understand, the passing down of our basic who we are as people. Okay, so I mean, for example, if you say, "Oh, is it found in the DNA or in the mitochondrial DNA, or which DNA is it found in?" I won't be able to tell you. Okay, but this is why it is important for Jesus to be of a virgin birth. Okay, because he cannot inherit genes from a father and a mother and still be born sinless. Okay, so if you look at this, the virgin birth of Christ is not an option or a nice sign, so that people know he's the Messiah. Okay, of course that's true, but going back to the creation story, you find that Jesus had to be of a virgin birth. The Messiah, God in human flesh, must be a virgin birth because he cannot carry the Adamic genes or DNA or whatever you want to call it. It has to be separate, and otherwise he'll be continuing that line of sin. Yeah.
So there's another question by Samuel.
Okay. Who is Cain's wife? Okay, the Bible doesn't say who is Cain's wife, and this is often raised as a question. It's a good one, but you must understand this, first of all, that if there are no other people on earth other than brothers and sisters, okay, then brothers and sisters don't really mean a thing. You say that you are relatives because there are people outside, so you say they are family members. But if everybody is family, there was probably no term for it. Okay, so like I think the story of the Blue Lagoon, I kind of remember it vaguely. One young boy and girl, they got stranded on an island, right? Then they reproduce and all that. I don't know if they were brother and sister or not or whatever, but if that is all you know and you don't know anything else, okay, there is no sin involved in reproducing with a member of your family simply because there was no concept of anything else. Okay, so there is nothing to compare with. Also, you must understand that this genetic loading comes over time. So Adam and Eve were made genetically perfect in that sense. They don't have all these genetic loads, and so you will also not have the same kind of deformity and oddities that come with marriages among close relatives. Okay, because they were basically the genetic corruption had not happened yet. Yeah. Okay, so thank you for your question. I know there are lots of questions, and probably we can kind of keep going and
Yeah.
when you cover the whole Old Testament. Yeah.
Can I
Yes.
can I just share one thing on Helen's question?
Yes.
Her question was, okay, what's the gene? Or how do we know today, right? That was the question. But according to the scripture, I mean, I'm not sure this is right or wrong. I'm just throwing it out that Adam's sin was a spiritual rather than what do you call biological. I mean, this is my understanding, and the Bible teaches that the sin entered through the world through Adam. So, since it's a spiritual condition than a biological condition, so humanity spiritually, affected by spiritually rather than genetically. I don't know how far this is true. What do you think?
Generally, we say that the fall of Adam was total, meaning that it was both physical and spiritual. Okay, and so for example, today when we talk about we are fallen creatures, Does that mean that we are fallen creatures when we say that? Does that mean we say that because we are all going to die? Remember when God says, "In the day that you eat of it, you will surely die," right? So that death probably included physical as well. Okay, so the judgment was going to be a physical judgment. It was also a spiritual judgment because then they started blaming each other, Adam and Eve, and you find that sin had entered into the world. It's the Pandora's box. And what about intellectually? So spiritual death, the fall also includes our mind. So we no longer think very sensibly or logically, and being sensible and logical becomes a problem. Okay, so the fall is also emotional. We don't feel the right things anymore. Sometimes we feel envy, sometimes we feel greed and lust and all that. So we believe that the fall of humanity is total. It affects every part of us. We do not become devils. So somebody uses this illustration. It's just like a glass of water. If you put a drop of poison into it, it affects a whole glass of water. You can no longer separate the water from the poison once it gets mixed in. Okay, so the fall of humanity is like that. It reflects what we are today in our fallen nature. All of us, every part of us is infected by sin. Okay, and so I'm using DNA as an illustration or as an example of how sin is being passed down. The question is, what we were addressing was whether it's the federal view or the traducian view. So different people have different views of how the sin of Adam affects us. Okay, that's the question that we are trying to answer. So the federal headship view is that because he is federally our first father, therefore it affects us. The traducian view is that it is all bound up together, whether it is biological, spiritual, mental, and all that is all bound up together. And everybody that comes from Adam and Eve becomes a sinner because it is bound up in its entire person. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So these are all good questions, and actually these questions are issues that we will study in systematic theology under the subject of anthropology, mankind. Okay, so eventually if we offer systematic theology, if you want to know, then these are some of the questions that we can answer in greater detail with all the biblical evidences and all that. Okay, very good. That being the case, we will now close today's session, and those of you who are taking it for credit, please get ready to take the quiz.